Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alex Fenlon, and I am a co-chair of LIBRA's Copyright and Legal Matters Working Group. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to this webinar on the EU Accessibility Act and research libraries. We are recording this webinar, and LIBRA will share it in the usual ways. If you can ensure your microphones are muted, please, that will be fantastic. Thank you. Today, we will be talking about accessibility and how changes to EU law impact on us as libraries, as service providers, and the impact on our users. Our speakers today are Jennifer Curry-Jahnke from the University of Birmingham. Jennifer will give us an overview of the legal framework and the things we need to be aware of. Simon Holt and Ted Gies from Elsevier RELX will then talk through some of the issues and challenges that they face, offering some hints and tips to provide accessible published materials, as well as accessible systems and platforms, etc. We should have plenty of time for questions at the end of the presentations when we will open the floor, and please do use the chat in the meantime. To give you a quick overview of LIBRA, LIBRA are an organization of research libraries across Europe supporting outstanding research and the growth and sharing of knowledge. There are more than 420 members in over 40 countries, and LIBRA has a number of specialist working groups designed to support and enable this mission. LIBRAeurope.eu has more information. The Copyright and Legal Matters Working Group, which I am a co-chair of, is a group of librarians, lawyers, professors, information and communication professionals working on legal issues as they impact on research libraries. We meet regularly to share news, updates, practice and advice on issues common to our members. We monitor legislative developments and the impact it has on our activity as research libraries, and we also provide input into LIBRA's advocacy in related areas. Our current priority areas are AI, of course, but also supporting the reuse of scientific information, academic freedom, and data tracking and privacy issues. More information can be found via the link below, and if you are interested in becoming a member, please do reach out to me or my co-chairs, and the details are on the LIBRA webpage. Moving swiftly on to today's session, however, our first speaker is Jennifer Curry-Jahnke. Jennifer is an award-winning professor and academic researcher and a consultant with academic institutions and organizations across the globe. As a digital accessibility expert, Jennifer is an active member of legislative committees, an international speaker, and is a certified member of the International Association of Accessibility Professionals. Jennifer is currently the manager of digital accessibility at the University of Birmingham and the principal educator with accessibilityconsulting.ca. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here with both Simon and Ted as well. I'm going to start just by giving a quote from the European Commission about a definition of the European Accessibility Act. They state that the EAA is a directive that aims to improve the functioning of the internal market for accessible products and services by removing barriers created by divergent rules in member states. The EAA was created to respond to the growing use of information and communication technology in modern society. The creation of the Act is also part of the EU's responsibility under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The businesses that are impacted by the EAA will benefit from ensuring accessibility because there will be common rules on accessibility in the EU, leading to cost reduction overall. It will make it easier for cross-border trading, ensuring that products have to have the same accessibility standards in all of the different states. And there's more market opportunities for accessible products and services. While persons with disabilities and our elderly community will benefit from more accessible products and services in the market, ensuring that those products and services are offered at a more competitive price. There's fewer barriers when accessing things like transportation, education, and the open labor market, as well as more jobs available where accessibility expertise is needed. The aim of the EAA is to strengthen the rights of persons with disabilities to access goods and services and to eliminate and prevent barriers to the free movement of certain accessible products and services arising from divergent accessibility requirements in the member states, thus ensuring the availability of accessible products and services in the EU market. Next slide, Alex. These are just some of the highlights of the EAA, and I wanted to kind of pull out the things that were really relevant to publishing and libraries. So when we look at the different applicable products and services placed on the market, anything that is updated after the 28th of June 2025, or that is currently active, must conform to the requirements of the Act, and I'll go into those requirements. Products or services already on the market but not updated since before that date don't have to conform until they are updated. So for things that are live in the cloud or often refreshed, they have to meet this accessibility requirement. However, if they're not updated often and they remain consistent, then they have to be updated by the 28th of June 2030 at the absolute latest. Deadlines after that all fall on the 28th of June. So by 2022, member states needed to notify the EU of their implementation acts. Again, this is a harmonizing act or directive in order that everybody is consistent. That's not all EU states have met that deadline just yet. By 2025, so this coming June 28th, all new products and services must conform to the EAA. By 2027, emergency services must conform. By 2030, that's the expiry of the 5-year exception. So if you had a product by 2025 and you didn't update it, you have to have it done by this date. And then by 2045, there's an expiry of the 20-year exception for long life service terminals. And long life service terminals that are installed before 2025 don't have to be replaced until they either reach the end of their economic life or by that 28th of June, 2045. So this upcoming deadline, the 28th of June of this year, is the deadline for products and services. This means after this date, any new products and services must conform to the Act, or if they are updated. At this time, covered organizations should have active plans for conformance underway, plans to design for and verify accessibility, document their conformance efforts, and verify their supplier chain. Next slide. So what is covered? For products, we're looking at computers and operating systems, smartphones and other communication devices, TV equipment related to digital television services, self-service machines such as payout terminals, ATMs, ticketing and check-in machines, and devices used for communications such as audiovisual media access and e-readers. For services, it's electronic communications, audiovisual media services such as digital TV and streaming services, transport, banking, consumer services such as ticketing and information sites, your bank account access, or the content that is actually on the self-service terminals, as well as electronic books or ebooks, e-commerce, and these are organizations that sell goods and services online, and emergency access number 112. Next slide. What is not covered? So products, we're looking at things like medical devices, unless they also function as an assistive technology. And the example here is such as a cochlear implant for hearing. Any long life installed products, and as I mentioned, like a self-service terminal, if it's installed before the 28th of June, and when replaced or by June 2045 at the latest, then it must conform to the EAA. Digital maps don't have to conform, but they do have to have an accessible alternative, such as a turn-by-turn text directions. And content provided by a third party who is outside of the EU and not subject to the requirements and over which the economic operator has no control. So for example, when the content is provided by a third party as part of a contracted services, that content is under the control of the economic operator. So it therefore has to meet the EAA. This content is not exempted even if it's provided by a third party outside of the EU. So contracts with third-party content providers should include EAA conformance obligations. Next slide. Fundamental alterations and disproportionate burdens. So these are two areas that may impact an individual. So a fundamental alteration would be saying that we can't make this accessible because it's not part of its everyday functioning. And therefore, to make it accessible would be an undue burden on the organization, causing us to not be able to continue operating. So for example, if we had a device intended solely for audio transmission, such as, I thought this was just a funny name. In my head, it's like a flip phone, but the EAA example called it a dumb phone, as opposed to a smartphone, which can then give audio and provide captioning and other visual information, as opposed to a flip phone that doesn't have that feature. So making it have to comply would be a burden to that service. So they don't have to make those fundamental alterations. So that means the fundamental alteration means a change for accessibility to a product or service requires a significant change to its nature. A disproportionate burden is the concept that it applies to smaller organizations without the ability to meet all of the EAA requirements with their resources, but they must observe the following conditions. If a particular accessibility feature is a disproportionate burden, but others are not, then the other features must still be made to be accessible. They have to maintain and provide an accessibility assessment report on request with the disproportionate burden and the reasons why it's in place. And then every 5 years, or when the product or service is altered, the disproportionate burden exemption must be reviewed to see if it still applies or if it's now reasonable to make it accessible. The Act explicitly states the lack of priority, time, or knowledge should not be considered to be a legitimate reason. Additionally, micro enterprises with 10 or fewer employees are also exempt from the assessment and reporting requirements because that would cause likely a disproportionate burden. Next slide. The European Accessibility Act puts in a robust mechanism to ensure compliance and requires the EU member states to ensure that regular compliance checks are done, that if they do receive complaints, those complaints are reviewed and followed up with the complainer, and that companies must take necessary corrective actions when they receive those complaints. People know which authority to turn to with their complaint, depending on the location of the product and service. As of this June 28th, customers will be able to file complaints before national courts or authorities if services or products do not respect the new rules. When we look at the different EU states that have put in place their the regulations, we can look to a few to see how they've interpreted the EAA. So for example, in France, if a publisher hasn't met all of their responsibilities, they've identified 5 possible reasons they may incur a penalty, such as publishing a non-accessible ebook or specialized software, not providing the information requested to the governing body, which is called ARCOM, not adequately describing the accessibility of the publication, not taking corrective measures in case of non-compliance, and not informing ARCOM of the corrective measures taken, so the legislative body. They can also be fined up to 7,500 euros for any one of the above and can refer cases to the public prosecutor. So there is penalties and fines. Next slide. The EAA relies on harmonized standards to define technical conformance. And conformance is one that's really hard for interpretation. And the EAA provides only sort of a guidance or a framework. And right now, the EAA is a directive, and it references the directive of the EN 301-549. And this is the accessibility requirements for ICT products and services. Now, the EN 301549 is currently undergoing a refresh, and they have it out for public consultation right now, at which point it will be updated accordingly. But what the EAA does say is that products and services must follow the POUR principles. So POUR. This means users must be able to P, perceive the content, O, operate the content, U, understand the content, and rely on robust content, which is the R, for content to work for them, not only with their assistive technology, but also on the platform of their choosing and in the browser of their choice. Next slide. The EAA also references functional performance criteria. Now, this is sort of thought of as a next step to those POUR principles. They describe general types of issues that challenge people with disabilities. Each of these criteria can fit into one of those POUR categories: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And they are usage without vision, usage with limited vision, without perception of color, without hearing or limited hearing, without vocal capacity, and with limited manipulation or strength or reach. We also want to minimize the risk of photosensitive seizures, so for flashing, and with usage of limited cognition. The only one that doesn't fit into the POUR principles is privacy. And this is because accessibility accommodations can create new privacy risks that might not be discovered in a mainstream privacy review. So safe features are important to an accessible user experience. Next slide. Common requirements for all products and services ensure that they must be available in more than one sensory channel. So whether that's vision or hearing or touch, text must be displayed in a font of adequate size and shape, although nobody really defines what adequate means. Sufficient contrast and with adjustable space between the letters, lines, paragraphs. Content must be understandable, made available a text version of content that can be used with assistive technology, and be provided in alternative forms of presentation for non-textual content. Next slide. Specific to publishing, publishers are required to produce their digital publications in an accessible format and require the entire supply chain, from book production to consumption, to make content available to users. Users must be able to carry out the entire process independently. This means that electronic books, metadata, e-commerce, including mobile, dedicated to e-reading software and electronic e-reading devices must be accessible and comply. When we look specifically at electronic books, we think they need to ensure that the ebook contains audio in addition to text. It must include synchronized text-to-speech technology, again, as long as that's part of its functioning requirement. The ebook digital files must not prevent assistive technology from operating seamlessly. And the content must be displayed clearly, and access to navigation of the file content must be flexible. The ebooks must be discoverable through their metadata, and digital rights management implementation must allow assistive technology to interact with the content, as well as the user must be able to locate the book from an internet bookstore. They must be able to buy or borrow that book, and then they must be able to read it with their e-reader, computer program, or mobile app independently. And next slide, I think this is my last one, so I'm just slightly over, I apologize. For e-reader, EPUB, and the Marrakesh Treaty, the e-reader and EPUB requirements imply, ebook requirements imply requirements for the e-reader hardware. They provide mechanisms to personalize the display. They must allow for the synchronization of text with audio and support users to navigate the content. They recommend the EPUB, well, W3C actually recommends, and the EAA maps to it, is EPUB 3. It's a format for ebooks that meet all of these requirements. Just a note that the Marrakesh Treaty is also applied to the EAA, indicating that there is an international copyright regime that allows authorized organizations to create accessible digital copies of copyrighted works with the requirements to avoid unauthorized distribution. And I think I'll stop there and pass it over to Simon, or probably Alex first. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. That was really interesting and a super quick overview of a complex piece of legislation. Our next speaker is Simon Holt. Simon is a senior product manager, for content accessibility at Elsevier, where he leads the work making books, journals, audio and video accessible to people with disabilities. As a sight impaired person himself, accessibility is important to him personally as well as professionally. He has worked in scholarly publishing for over 15 years, working with authors and editors, and is involved in several industry initiatives, including serving as a director for the Society of Scholarly Publishing, a member of an advisory board for the Royal National Institute for Blind People, and as a trustee for a sight loss charity, My Vision Oxfordshire. Over to you, Simon.
Thanks very much. So thanks for the very nice introduction, Alex. So today you're going to get a bit of a double header. So you're going to hear from me about content accessibility, about the words that we put on the page and kind of video and that kind of thing. And then you're going to hear from my colleague Ted a bit later on around kind of the products and the platforms side of things. I thought it would be really helpful for you guys to get both sides of this equation. As Alex mentioned, I'm a registered blind person myself, so accessibility is really important to me because it allows me to read and to learn. And over the next few minutes, I'm going to just give you a bit of a case study about how Elsevier, the science publisher that I work for, is approaching the implementation from a content point of view of the laws that we just heard about before passing over to Ted, who's going to cover the platforms and the products kind of piece. If we can move to the next slide, please. So I thought it was actually really important, even though, you know, I know we're talking about compliance, I know we're talking about the law, and I know this is all very formal and legal, but actually, why are we doing this? Who is this for? It's fundamentally so that the 1.5 billion people globally who have a disability are able to access content and to learn in the same way as everybody else. I think when we think about accessibility, we often think about visually impaired people like myself. But as you can see here, actually accessibility helps all kinds of people, right? So we're talking about hearing impaired people, dyslexic people, dyspraxic people, people with neurodivergencies, etc. And actually, around 15% of the world's working age population has a disability. And I think obviously the reason that we're all here, the reason we all do the careers that we do is because we care about people's ability to learn. And I think accessibility is really important because it really broadens the horizons of those who are able to learn and means that people are able to learn in their own way, whether that's seeing with their eyes or hearing with their ears or touching with their fingers. I'm thinking about things like Braille, for example, right? And so when we think about these laws, I would like to say that we're changing from an idea of kind of cost and compliance to one where we think about investment and opportunity. And we're giving the opportunity to send knowledge and information and learning to way more people than ever before. We're hopefully transforming the lives of millions of people here. And I'm really excited about that. And I'm going to hopefully in the next few minutes explain why. Next slide, please. So therefore, as publishers, right, you know, we are large science publishers. Why do we care about that? Well, you know, ultimately, we care about helping researchers advance science and healthcare. We care about disseminating knowledge, and this helps us to disseminate knowledge in order to improve our reach. So when Ted and I talk about making our content, our products or platforms more accessible. And you can see what some of our kind of goals and targets are here, some of which I will talk about and some more of which Ted will talk about in a moment. Actually, what we're really thinking about is not only compliance with the law, but really extending our reach of the content that we publish. So we see accessibility not as a kind of add-on extra to what we do, but actually a fundamental part of our mission, ensuring that what we do is having the biggest impact possible. Next slide, please. And so I wanted just to flag up here, obviously we've heard a lot about the European Accessibility Act, but I thought it was worth also mentioning the Americans with Disabilities Act Title II legislation, which comes into force in April 2026. And we can see this as the counterpart to the European legislation. It's worth saying that the American legislation is much more general. And so it, absolutely encompasses things like journals as well. Whereas as we've just heard, ebooks and e-commerce are really the focus of the EAA. It's also worth mentioning from a legal point of view that the means of enforcement of the two laws are slightly different. So as we've just heard, the EAA, really, if you're a member of the public and you feel that an organization is not EAA compliant, you go and you complain to the regulator will then take action. It's a bit different in America. With the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so how it works is the onus on making content accessible is actually on public authorities. So therefore on things like universities and hospitals and that kind of thing, right? And so what that means is that when they're engaging with publishers and, they obviously have contracts, so publishers provide them with material, they are asking us or requiring us even to make that material accessible. And so therefore, if you're a student at a university or a researcher and you think, well, this isn't accessible, you would complain to your university and your university would complain to the publisher. I thought, given the audience today, it was worth just mentioning that slight nuance in terms of how these laws are enforced. Certainly across the industry, certainly at Elsevier, but also I know across the industry, we're very cognizant of both of these laws. Happily, both of them rely on the same standard, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 AA standard. And so therefore, whether you're selling content into Europe or in America, actually your obligations are the same here, which is to provide content that meets the WCAG AA 2.1 web standards. And I'm going to talk a bit about what that involves later, and I know Ted is as well. Next slide, please. And so what's the purpose here? So I thought it was just worth just spending a little bit of time on this. And as I said, it's basically to improve people's lives. It's to ensure that everybody is on the same playing field, as we just heard before, a lot about harmonization here. And also basically making sure that if somebody is accessing a product or buying a product, they don't go through the process that I've certainly been through many times in my life, where you buy something and then you realize that it's not actually usable because it isn't accessible to you. And certainly when we're talking about, for example, the metadata requirements for the European Accessibility Act, I think these are vitally important, because actually, as a visually impaired person, it's really important to know whether what I'm paying for, what I'm accessing here, is going to be accessible to me, what features it has, what features it doesn't have. And this will mean that people like me are not wasting money on products that are not actually usable by us. I think that's going to be very important. And obviously, the EAA will help everybody get onto a more accessible common standard. Next slide, please. So every publisher, and I'm going to talk about obviously publishing now, every publisher will have different challenges, right? Ours is the volume of content that we publish. We're a big publisher. I think we're the biggest science publisher. I think last thing I read, we're responsible for about 70% of the world's scientific literature. And so for us, the big challenge here is being able to do this at scale, in front list, but also in terms of backlist, right, or previous published content. For other publishers, the challenge will be that they're a small publisher and resourcing is a problem, or the content that they publish is extremely interactive, right? I'm certainly not saying, and please don't take away from this, that, you know, we're somehow better than other publishers. It's just that size is the thing that is kind of we need to focus on here. So when we're thinking about solutions, scalability is a really important thing for us. Next slide, please. And so thinking about this, how are we going to be able to do this across all our book program, and then later, as we're looking at the American legislation, the journals program as well? Well, we have to do this at an enterprise level, right? Actually, accessibility, in the same way something like data privacy doesn't work if you've just got, you know, a couple of people dealing with this in one part of the organization. And one thing that I think we do quite well, and we have done well over the past couple of years, is really come together across the organization in a programmatic way to think about how we can really think about this in an aligned way. I know Ted is going to talk about collaboration in his talk, but essentially how we do this is that we have a program manager who basically aligns us all and makes sure that things happen. We have SMEs like Ted and I and some other people within individual teams. We have a champions program as well to make sure that the principles of accessibility are finding themselves into every part of the organization. And then obviously we have a steerco and a program board to make sure that this is all actually tied together. And therefore, by taking an aligned approach across the organization, we're able to prioritize and actually make sure that we're thinking about all the different elements of these laws. Otherwise, it just wouldn't be possible to make meaningful progress. Next slide, please. So I wanted just to quickly talk about this chart here, and I know Ted is going to come on to some of these themes. The main things that I'm involved with are on this right-hand side, the bit that it talks about content accessibility. So things like alt text, transcripts, captions, detailed descriptions for video, accessible metadata, accessible formats, so EPUB and enhanced PDF. These are the tenets, if you like.
You cannot do in an hour today.
Oh, sorry. If you're not talking, if you could go on mute, that would be great. These are the tenets that really make accessible publishing. And as I said, Ted will talk a lot about some of these other aspects, but briefly, it's very important to make sure that we're complying with the latest version of WCAG. It's very important that we're documenting what we're doing so that best practice can be shared as well. And it's really important that we have processes that are in place to make sure that we can make everything accessible, whether it's content or it's products, in a scalable way. Next slide, please. And so what does good look like for us? Well, but as we just heard about before, by this year, by this June, we need to be making sure that we are we've really got our front list, our go forward program fully accessible, right? So, you know, we're already rolling out alt text, video, we're doing a great job. The metadata solution is in place now, and we will be publishing everything, all our books in EPUB format on our Science Direct platform from June onwards. We also need to think about the backlist, right? And in terms of the backlist, we have around 87,000 titles in our backlist. It's clearly going to be a multi-stage process to make sure that these are all remediated, to make sure they're accessible. So what we're doing at the moment is prioritizing in terms of making sure the most recent and the most used content is prioritized in terms of remediation, but also then putting together an on-request service. So if there are older books where we can, outside of the disproportionate burden criteria that that people want to be made accessible, they can request that and we will get those made accessible for them. And so ultimately, to go back to what I was talking about, good to me looks like multimodality, that people are able to learn in the way that best suits them, whether that's seeing with their eyes or listening with their ears or touching with their hands. Clearly, as I said on slide one, this is building a house one floor at a time. I think we're making really good strides at the moment, but clearly there's also quite a lot of work to do. And that's why I'm sitting here and saying, actually, we're on the journey. We've made a really good start, but there's a lot more work still to go. Next slide, please. So this is what a potential long-term roadmap could look like. Doesn't mean I'm committing we're going to do all of this stuff straight away, but the idea here is that each year we're going to do a little bit more, and I know Ted is going to talk a little bit more about that as well. Accessibility isn't a magic bullet. It isn't a one and done. It's as technology improves, our capabilities will improve as well, and our plan is to add a little bit more to this every year and make sure that we're making progress, not just in terms of compliance, but going beyond that as well, because as I mentioned, this isn't a tick box for us. It's a really core part of what we do in terms of enriching the content that we're publishing. Next slide, please. So then this is the last slide, right? So AI is obviously the hot topic of the day. How can it help and how can it not? Well, AI really helps us scale quickly, but AI isn't the solution. It's by itself. So thinking about alt text, for example, which is an area that a lot of people have talked about in terms of AI. AI might be able to draft some stuff. AI is quite good at what I'm going to call translating. So if you've got a photograph or an illustration in front of you, it can tell you what's there. It's not that great at what I'm going to call interpreting. So when we're talking about complex charts and graphs that you can read in a few different ways, AI can't really handle that in any meaningful way, right? And so you're always going to need human beings to review content. And this brings me on to authors. So, what we're doing in terms of our content is we are using AI in the drafting process. We're then getting SMEs at our suppliers to review them, and then it's coming through to authors at the proof stage, right? I know a lot of publishers are getting authors to write their own alt text. We feel that this is quite labor intensive for authors, but we also feel that alt text is a different type of writing to writing a chapter, right? It's very technical. And I personally think the Venn diagram of those people that want to write alt text and can write alt text efficiently is quite small, especially in science publishing, where maybe for a lot of people, English may not be their first language. So what we do is we put the alt text in front of them and we say to them, please check this and check that this is accurate. And so we ask for accuracy, completion, and relevance. And so therefore, what we're doing therefore is combining the best of both worlds. We're using the author's scientific knowledge, but hopefully not taking up too much of their time. And again, in terms of backlists, we've been asked a lot about this. This is where we need to prioritize and make sure that people can get content when they need it. So if they need a book that we haven't already yet made accessible, they can request that and we will get that to them within a reasonable period of time, which I think is probably 3 weeks or something like that. We don't want people waiting forever, but also realistically, we're not going to be able to make the 86,000 titles that we have in our backlist accessible in a click of a button. It just doesn't work like this. So we have to be pragmatic about that. I think that's everything from me. I'm going to hand over to Ted now, and hopefully he'll be able to fill in the gaps in my presentation and talk a little bit more about the products and platform side of things. Ted, over to you.
Thanks, Simon. Ted, I'm just going to do a quick introduction, if I may. Thanks, Simon. That was really useful. So our final speaker is Ted Gies. Ted leads the digital accessibility team at Elsevier and chairs the RELX Corporate Responsibility, Accessibility Objectives and Policy Committee. Ted has worked across RELX companies for over 25 years as a UX designer, researcher, globally and a global accessibility authority. He's developed an accessibility champions program and belting program used by over 70 product development teams. Fascinated by the ease to use and barrier-free information in the STEM field, his current projects include a company maturity model and accessible data visualizations. TED collaborates with many universities, disability communities, and IT vendors on producing more inclusive digital content for the web. Ted, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex, and thank you very much, Jen and Simon, for your very informative pieces. So, collaborating to ensure accessible digital platforms is the name of my piece today, and we can go next slide. So the common theme across my talk is to mobilize people to work together on accessibility towards continuous improvement using widely available resources, many of which are free. And to ensure that the right roles of people are working together on accessibility, because it's not just one person's job. So to be successful, we must collaborate together with generosity. And so here's a photo of our Elsevier digital accessibility team at the CSUN Assistive Technology Conference, which is only a few weeks away. And Simon and I will be there. Say hello if you're there as well. Next slide, please. So, Elsevier collaborates with dozens of organizations on our mission to create fully inclusive experiences. Given that Elsevier produces well over 400 digital products and services, what kinds of organizations should we be collaborating with? Well, we bring in several thought-leading companies, and in some cases, we also give our generous knowledge outward. So it's a two-way street, if you will. Within publishing, we learn the latest topics and techniques, keep up on standards and tools in both participating in the UK's PAAG group, that's the Publishers Association Accessibility Working Group, and also the Federation of European Publishers Accessibility Group. Both of those strongly recommended. There's several great forums with free webinars from the DAISY Consortium to the AXCON conference next week, virtually produced by DQ. There's a wealth of knowledge, both in the digital publishing industry and accessibility, and just more vanilla web accessibility to be found on the web through different organizations. If we're talking about books, which I will cover this in a slide or two, Benetech is a thought leader out of Palo Alto, and they will get you on your journey to the coveted EPUB book, which Simon mentioned earlier. And speaking of collaborating, anyone on this webinar can reach myself, Simon, or the digital accessibility team by just sending a note to accessibility@elsevier.com. So we are very approachable, very collaborative. Thanks, Jen, for the posting of the link to AXCON coming up, which, by the way, Elsevier will be presenting a great story on the way that we do user research and personas around people with disabilities. So tune in for that next week. So next slide, please. Okay. As mentioned by both Jen and Simon, EPUB books are extremely important in accessible publishing. EPUB is the digital book, the standard digital book format of the future. It's now governed by the W3C in terms of the spec. And I think most large publishers and medium-sized publishers are producing EPUB. So that's a great sign of the times that there is just this ultimate, this very uber accessible format, whether you're a person with low vision, a person who's blind, or someone with a reading disorder such as dyslexia, EPUB has it all. And so this really starts with XML-based workflows. So this is kind of like this is kind of a push to get the publishing industry overall to adopt EPUB. But for some publishers, if you're not starting with XML, I would strongly recommend investing in that workflow, because once you have an XML-based workflow, you're able to create many downstream accessible formats, including tag PDFs, HTML, EPUB, Vital Source, and many others. And if you really want to certify your EPUB capabilities as being conformant with WCAG and EPUB 1.1, I would strongly recommend partnering with Benetech, who I mentioned earlier. They've got a very well matured, globally certified accessible, the GCA certification. And if you go through their certification, then you get to tout your quality of your EPUBs through that nice seal, which I'm showing there in my slides graphically. Additionally, it's not just the accessibility of your book and platform that you should be concerned with. You want to make sure that your consumers, Simon alluded to this earlier, consumers should be able to know how good your accessibility features are in your ebooks and platforms. So that's where EPUB metadata comes into play, but there's also a way to showcase your book accessibility statement, and you can partner with Textbox's Aspire program, and they will rate you on several criteria. How clearly are you articulating your features such as alt text for images? How easy is it to approach Elsevier or a publisher and get an alternative format request fulfilled? So if you do all these things great, Aspire will give you a high score. Elsevier Science Direct received a 97% gold rating a few years back. But it's a really great way to kind of get accreditation, but also get coaching on which areas of your accessibility need some help. And that's both true for the GCA and the Aspire accreditations. Next slide, please. So speaking of collaboration, collaboration is very much a two-way street. We've been lucky enough to benefit from some of our customers sharing free audits to us. So within the US, there's the Library Academic Alliance. That's a consortium of over 100 universities, and they conduct free consulting reviews. They've done, I think, 124 total. And in many cases, they will, within about a week, and this is what I would call a nice surprise, they will select one of your products and hire an expert in the field to run an audit, and then very nicely deliver a tidy report and giving vendors really good insights in terms of how to improve their products for accessibility. So, I would say that Elsevier has some very highly accessible platforms and products already, but it's amazing, even our more mature products, Science Direct, for instance, we always learn something new from the free audits from the LAA. So very thankful that that program is in place, and being able to receive feedback externally and take those requirements or those findings and translate them to fixes or design improvements. It's a very collaborative way to do business. So the two-way street. So yeah, we at Elsevier use, Simon earlier mentioned charts and graphs. Elsevier products, we use lots of data visualizations, as you can imagine. And 8 years ago, we found that we needed a highly accessible chart platform for our products, such as Scopus, the world's largest abstract database. So at the time, we were using HighCharts, a great company out of Norway. And we said, hey, HighCharts, we use your charts and graphs. We love your product. Would you like to work with us on making more accessible data visualizations? They said, yeah, let's work together. And within a year, we developed the first screen reader friendly chart library ever done, and the work continues today. We're actually going to present with HighCharts next month at CSUN, and we're getting into more innovative things like sonification, tactile graphics, AI described trend lines, and things like that. So Collaborations are just one of those examples where no one person, no one company can solve all the accessibility problems on their own. And I think it's really that feeling of open and generous collaboration that leads to big things in accessibility. Okay, next slide, please. So let's just say that you're brand new to accessibility. Maybe you're not ready to start your own collaboration today, but you're saying, okay, well, maybe on my library website or on my corporate website, I just want to kind of take the pulse of how accessible is it? Well, guess what? There are a multitude of free accessibility testing tools out there on the web. Many of these are either browser plugins or they come free with your operating system. Very simple test would be to, hey, don't even need to install anything. Can you actually navigate all of the content on your website using your keyboard? Do all of the links, buttons? Does your mobile menu, your hamburger, does your global navigation, does everything work with a keyboard only? It's fairly easy to run that test, and you'll learn a lot just in terms of, hey, if the website is keyboard friendly, it's more likely to work with other assistive technology, such as voice input, mouth sticks, as well as screen readers. But these tools right here that we've got bulleted, I'll just quickly voice them here. The color contrast analyzer, Wave, that's a great plugin, free plugin for your browser. The Axe tool, the accessibility bookmarklets, screen readers, which the two listed here are free. VoiceOver comes installed with your Mac OS, and NVDA, a great open source screen reader for Windows users. If you're interested in making your PowerPoints or Word documents more accessible, Microsoft has really improved their free accessibility checkers, and they'll guide you through how to fix things like alt text for images. And if you're producing PDF documents, the Pack tool is a free download, and similar to the Office Checker, it will guide you through fixing your PDF problems. Okay, next slide, please. So real quick on how to convey conformance with accessibility. So Simon talked about scaling the approach. One common denominator for showcasing a company's accessibility is the use of the Accessibility Conformance Report, otherwise known as ACR or VPATs. So Elsevier, as many companies do, measure our conformance with WCAG using ACRs. And they're a very technical, comprehensive view. They're used by our customers during procurement, and also used by disability services offices to help plan accommodation for people with disabilities who may be using a product, and they need to really figure out if, for, let's just say, a video-based product doesn't have closed captioning or audio description, DSOs can use the information from the VPAT to better plan appropriate accommodations. So we've had at Elsevier very positive feedback on our ACRs, and when they're done well, they can help an organization build trust with their communities. But keep in mind that conformance, compliance, ACRs, they're one lens, one measuring tool for accessibility, and we really need to balance that approach with conducting end user research with people with disabilities. So I've got a screenshot here on the right. It's a picture of me sitting down with someone who experiences low vision, and they're using one of our products with a screen magnification AT. I think it's Zoom Text. So sure, you could be 100% compliant with the standards, but you really don't know if your product is going to be accessible until you see and experience the product in the wild. Someone with a disability needs to be able to use your product in the wild. So that's the other part of the equation. And keep in mind that when it comes to user testing, I mentioned we're going to do a talk next week around personas. Elsevier is going to present at the DQ AXCON. Disability personas can have a wide array of needs. So someone with low vision uses assistive technology very differently from somebody who is blind using a text-to-speech program like Jaws. So just keep that in mind. We try to really cover the wide array of disability personas that as wide as we can. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, okay, so I'll touch on this very quickly and then hopefully we'll have a couple minutes for questions. One of the things I would strongly recommend to organizations that produce multiple digital products, especially on the web, is to create accessible design libraries. So this particular screenshot is from our graphene design system, and it's the checkbox widget, okay? So, checkbox is the way you select an item on a screen. But this is one of about 65 different user interface elements, all built with accessibility in mind, all with accessible colors and accessible code. So this will really help propagate accessibility through all of the different products, which helps us scale our approach very nicely. Okay, next slide, please. If you have never employed accessibility champions as a technique to help share the workload of accessibility, I would strongly recommend looking up. Say, Intuit has a great accessibility champions program that they've blogged about quite a bit. I would study theirs. But whose job is accessibility anyways? At least within Elsevier, we help mobilize and collaborate, making sure that we have 4 champions at least on each product. That would include product managers, UX designers, software engineers, and quality assurance. But of course, you could have an accessibility champion in a content management role, in an upper management role, or even a procurement role. I've also worked with several librarians who champion accessibility by helping run user tests with patrons with disabilities, help promoting consistent ways to use products with screen readers and things like that. So look up accessibility champions. I think it's a great method for helping create that co-ownership of accessibility. And I see there's about 1 minute left. I'll hand it over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Ted. Really appreciate that. And thanks to Simon and Jen for going through their slides as well. So I'll just stop sharing there. We are super short on time, and just looking at the comments in the chat there, I can see that we have a recommendation for the screenreader.app website, which will talk you through screen reader text on Android and an Apple phone. So please go and check that out. There's also a question about digitized special collections and library archival materials, and where to go for advice about making those accessible, and whether indeed they are subject to the regulations. So Jen, that might be aimed at you, but Ted and Simon, if you want to step in, I know you've spoken about backlogs and back files and things like that. So yeah, in relation to archival materials, special collections, what do we need to do as library and research organizations to try and comply for those kinds of materials?
Yeah, so with regards to things that are in the backlist and archived, so for things that are archived, they are exempt from the requirements. However, if there's an alternative way to provide the same information, that is encouraged. It's also encouraged under the human rights laws. With regards to the backlist, it really is a bit of a challenge right now because of the collections are so large, and they don't want to discourage publishers from taking down collections because they're not accessible. So there is what's called an accessible backlist ebooks lab project, or the ABE lab project, ABE, and I'll put the link in the chat. And what they're doing is it's a collaborative project aimed to provide publishers with correct information about options and costs for remediation to make backlist ebooks accessible. They're starting their research activities to provide insight on how a publisher can evaluate the impact of converting any backlist ebook titles, which elements in the backlist hinder accessibility, how to categorize clusters of ebooks that may need the same treatment, and any tools on the marketplace that can help with remediation of different ebook categories, as well as complete costs per title. So I'll put that in the chat, and then if Ted or Simon want to add anything to that.
Thanks, Jen. I'm just conscious of time, and I think what I'll actually do is draw the session to a close today. I wanted to thank Jennifer, Ted, and Simon for their time, for their excellent presentations. Hopefully that's got some thoughts ticking over in people's minds as we move towards the 28th of June 2025, which is the all-important date within the next few months. Thank you very much for our speakers once again. One last plug from me. The Copyright and Legal Matters Working Group are also doing another webinar next Wednesday, which is on the juicy topic of copyright and AI and how that impacts on library activities. And the details for that can be found on the libraeurope.eu website. And I'll leave you with that note. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon, and enjoy the rest of your day wherever you are. Thank you very much.